Hello everyone, welcome back. Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be discussing the exposure triangle and the rule of thirds. As we discussed last time, the exposure triangle is composed of three elements: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So when we are adjusting one of those, it affects the other three. And we want to have balance in our photography. And so as we look at the triangle and the three sides of it, first we want to talk about the ISO. And as we've discussed in previous sessions, the ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. The higher that number, the more sensitive it is to light. And also, as we increase the ISO, we can introduce grain into the picture, noise, and other artifacts. So we want to keep our ISO as low as possible. So again, ISO controls your camera's sensitivity to light. The lower the ISO, less light. The higher the ISO, more light. And so depending on the setting and your subject that you're shooting, you want to keep that ISO as low as possible. When you're outside, maybe an ISO of 100. Inside, you may need to increase it to 200, 400, depending on the amount of light. And then the next one is aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening in your camera's lens, and that's expressed in f-stop. So, and it's the reverse. The smaller the number, the larger the hole. So we have to think in reverse for this one when we're thinking of ISO and aperture. So ISO, the larger the number, more light. Aperture, the smaller the number, more light. The larger the number, less light. And one of the importances of the aperture, it also controls your depth of field. How much is in focus? So a smaller ISO, lower ISO, the number smaller size, you're going to have a less depth of field. And in certain settings, you might want that. If you're doing portrait, you might want a smaller depth of field. If you're shooting a landscape, you want everything in focus, so you might go up to f11, f16, f22, and even higher, depending on your camera and its ability to go up to higher numbers. And then the last part of the triangle we talk about is shutter speed, exposure time, the amount of time in seconds that the shutter is open, and it controls motion. So the larger the number, you're able to freeze motion. The smaller the number, you're going to introduce blur into the picture. So if you have a subject that's sitting still, you can go with a smaller number. If you have a moving subject, someone running, you want to go with a higher number. So again, ISO, sensitivity to light; aperture, the size of the opening; shutter speed, how much, the amount of time in seconds that your shutter is open. So a couple scenarios: you have an image that's too dark, you're going to need to adjust one of the three things: ISO, aperture, or shutter speed. So an image that's too dark, we want to slow down the shutter speed, lower the aperture, let more light in, and raise the ISO. Again, you don't want to go too high because you're introducing noise or grain into the picture. You have an image that's too bright, so we can decrease the ISO, increase the shutter speed, and increase the aperture. You're going to need to do one of those three things. So keep those things in mind when we're talking about the exposure triangle. Okay, so next let's talk about the rule of thirds. hopefully we can get this going. Let's see. For some reason, that's not the one I want. Okay. Well, that's not it either. Okay. Maybe still trying to get there. Sorry about that. Well, hmm. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off, the rule of thirds. And this is one of the first things we learn in photography classes. And what it does is it helps us to create balance and interest in our photography. And just like other rules, this one is meant to be broken. But one of the things we have to remember when we're breaking a rule is we want to have something to replace it. And we want to make sure that we've learned the rule so when we do break it, it's more effective. So just what is the rule of thirds? It's adding interest into your image. It's what others see when they're looking at your image. And so as you're taking an image, you would have done this in your mind through your viewfinder or the LCD screen on the back of your camera. And it's helping you to frame your shot. And so with this grid in mind, it now identifies the 4 points that I have in the on the grid. And it also gives you useful positions for the elements of your photo. So again, you want to place your image at these points of interest where they're intersecting along the lines so that your photo becomes more balanced and will enable the viewer to interact with the image so that they can see themselves in the image and it becomes more natural. And studies have shown that when viewing images, that people's eyes will usually go to one of these intersecting points most naturally rather than the center of the shot. And not saying that you can't put an image in the center of the shot, but when you use the rule of thirds, it's a more natural way of viewing an image rather than working against it. And a couple of tips I like to keep in mind is when we're photographing an image, you want to make sure that if you're shooting a person, not shooting, but photographing a person, that you want to keep their eyes above the top lines of the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds also helps you to keep the horizon lines straight when you're shooting photographing nature scenes. Using this rule comes naturally to some photographers, but for many of us it takes a little practice before it becomes second nature. So again, remember that breaking the rule can result in striking shots once you've learned it. So experiment with it, and also you can a lot of the software programs allow you to edit photos so that you can keep the rule of thirds in mind, and also helps you to reframe images so that it fits within the rule of thirds. So just want to share with you a few images that I photographed that kind of highlights the rules. So this is a shot from a visit to the beach, some seagulls, and you can see that they're flying into the frame. And so it points your eyes to the seagulls. They're flying in. It looks like they're coming at you. Okay, so this next one, let's see, here we go. Here's that alligator. Okay, with this guy, you can see that he's filling up the frame. Although he looks pretty centered, his eye is off it's in the center of the frame, but it's off to the left side of the rule of nines. So it adds an interesting um, effect. And this is also an image that I won an award for, so I like this guy a lot. Let's see. And here we go. This is a composite, and so I framed him to be along the lines of the rule of third. So it's one that I intentionally edited in Photoshop to bring him in line with the rule of thirds. And let's see, I think this last one, let's see if I can, okay, so we have the ship here, same type of thing. So it's along the lines, keeping in mind the rule of thirds. So I hope you found this interesting. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to next time. Have a great day, and again, as always, thank you for joining me, and thank you for watching. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.